Behind the smile, 10 Texas wives who became killers inside their own homes. The crime scene: a retired fire captain goes missing from his own home. His boat is found drifting on a Texas lake. His medication is still inside it. 2 years later, investigators dig up his front yard and find not one body, but two. Welcome to the crime scene. I am your narrator. Tonight we are examining 10 cases from the state of Texas. 10 wives, 10 husbands, 10 investigations that moved through crime labs, courtrooms, and years of legal proceedings. Some of these women claimed self-defense. Some claimed innocence. Some never offered any explanation at all. What connected every single one of them was the setting, the family home, where the evidence was collected, where the truth was reconstructed, and where, in each case, the law eventually arrived. Texas covers nearly 269,000 square miles and holds more than 30 million people. Its criminal justice system is among the most active in the country. Its prosecutors are tenacious. Its juries are decisive. And its cases have produced some of the most consequential legal proceedings in American criminal history. Tonight, we go inside 10 of them. This is Behind the Smile, 10 Texas wives who became killers inside their own homes. If you are new here, hit that subscribe button right now. Let us get into Case 1. Case 1. Betty Lou Beats, Henderson County, Texas. Events: 1981 to 1983. Execution: February 24th. 2002. Bodies: 2 husbands. Both are buried on the same property. One beneath an ornamental wishing well in the front yard. One beneath a storage shed at the back. Both were killed by the same firearm. And for 2 years, nobody knew either of them was there. That is where this case begins. In August of 1983, a woman named Betty Lou Beats contacted the Henderson County Sheriff's Department in East Texas and reported that her 5th husband, Jimmy Don Beats, had gone missing after a fishing trip on Cedar Creek Lake. She was calm. She was composed. She provided a straightforward account. Authorities opened a missing persons case and began searching the lake. 6 days later, Jimmy Don's fishing boat was recovered near the Redwood Beach Marina. Inside, investigators found his fishing license, a life jacket, and his nitroglycerine tablets, the heart medication he depended on daily. The medication was in the boat. Jimmy Don was not. A man who requires daily cardiac medication does not willingly leave it behind. That detail registered with investigators immediately, but nobody surfaced. The case stalled, and in the weeks that followed, Betty Lou Beats began the process of accessing her husband's Dallas Fire Department pension and pursuing his life insurance policy, a $100,000 benefit, naming her as beneficiary. Nearly 2 years passed. Then, in June of 1985, the Henderson County Sheriff's Department received a credible tip. What investigators were told led them to apply for and receive a search warrant for the Cedar Creek Lake property where Betty Lou Beats lived. What they found when they searched that property closed the missing persons case and opened a capital murder investigation. Beneath the ornamental wishing well in the front yard of the property, investigators recovered the remains of Jimmy Don Beats. Forensic examination identified 2 .38 caliber bullet wounds. Beneath the storage shed at the rear of the property, investigators recovered a second set of remains. These were identified as Doyle Wayne Barker, Betty Lou Beats's 4th husband, who had disappeared in 1981 and had never been reported missing by anyone. Both men had been killed by the same caliber weapon. Both had been interred on the same property. Betty Lou Beats was arrested on June 8, 1985. 2 of her own children became the prosecution's most significant witnesses. Her son Robert Branson testified under a plea agreement that his mother had told him she intended to kill Jimmy Don before the act occurred, and that after the killing he had assisted in staging the abandoned fishing boat on Cedar Creek Lake to make the disappearance appear accidental. He also testified that he had helped move and conceal the remains. Her daughter Shirley Stegner testified that she had helped her mother conceal Doyle Wayne Barker's remains beneath the storage shed in 1981, 4 years before the investigation uncovered both graves. The testimony of her own children, combined with the forensic evidence recovered from the property, formed the core of the prosecution's case. At trial, Betty Lou Beats pleaded not guilty. She took the witness stand and testified that her son Robert was responsible for Jimmy Don Beats's death. The jury did not accept that account. She was convicted of capital murder under Texas law's murder for remuneration statute, which applies when a killing is committed for financial benefit. The jury determined that the motive was financial, specifically the pension and insurance policy. She was sentenced to death. What the jury never heard, and what became the central argument of her appeals over the following 15 years, was evidence of the extensive domestic abuse that Betty Lou Beets maintained she had endured across 5 marriages. That evidence was never presented because her trial attorney faced a direct conflict of interest. He had previously represented her in a civil matter involving the very death benefits that the prosecution was now characterizing as her motive. That conflict made it legally and ethically impossible for him to testify on her behalf about the timeline of when she became aware of those benefits, testimony that could have materially altered the motive argument. In 1991, a federal district court judge found that the attorney's conduct had violated her constitutional right to adequate legal representation and ordered a new trial. The state of Texas appealed. The United States Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals reinstated the death sentence. Subsequent appeals through both state and federal courts were exhausted. The legal concept of battered woman syndrome had not been widely incorporated into Texas criminal defense law at the time of her 1985 trial. Advocates argued that had modern standards been applied, the jury would have heard substantial evidence about the history of abuse she described. That evidence was never placed before a jury. Governor George W. Bush declined to intervene, consistent with his stated position that clemency consideration would be limited to cases of actual innocence. Betty Lou Beets was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Huntsville, Texas, on February 24, 2000. She was 62 years old. She made no final statement. She became the second woman executed in Texas following the reinstatement of capital punishment, and the fourth woman executed in the United States since the resumption of executions nationally in 1976. The case left behind enduring legal questions about the intersection of domestic abuse history, attorney conflict of interest, and capital sentencing questions that legal scholars and advocates continued to examine for years after her execution. Jimmy Don Beets' son James addressed the press outside the facility, asking that God be with her family. What the evidence established at trial was straightforward. 2 men, 2 graves, 1 property, 1 firearm. What the evidence could not fully resolve, because it was never fully presented, was the complete picture of the life that produced that outcome. That tension between the documented record and the incomplete record is a feature of this case that has never been resolved. Case 2. Celeste Beard, Travis County, Texas. Events: October 3, 1999. Death of victim, January 22, 2000. Conviction: 2003. A 74-year-old man called 911 from his own bedroom in the middle of the night, confused about what had just happened to him. He had been shot while he slept. His wife was in another wing of the house and told police she had heard nothing. Within 6 months of his death, she had remarried. That remarriage is what caused the shooter to pick up the phone and call investigators with a completely different story. That is where this case turns. Stephen Beard was a retired Fox broadcasting executive and co-founder of an Austin television station. He was a self-made multimillionaire with an estate valued at approximately $12 million. He was also a widower who had met a much younger woman named Celeste Johnson while she was working as a waitress at the Austin Country Club in 1993. The two married on February 18, 1995. Stephen adopted Celeste's twin daughters from a prior relationship. Friends and family of Stephen Beard expressed skepticism about the marriage from the beginning, describing a 40-year age gap and what they characterized as a fundamental mismatch in values. What was documented beyond dispute was the pace of Celeste Beard's spending. The couple maintained a household budget of $35,000 per month. Celeste routinely exceeded it. Her accountant would later testify about the specific figures. $321,000 spent in October and November of 1999 alone, $249,000 by mid-December, and a total of $670,000 in the 6 months following the shooting of her husband. Stephen Beard had previously discovered that Celeste had been removing jewelry belonging to his late wife from a safe deposit box. He filed for divorce. The couple reconciled. He withdrew the petition. In 1999, Struggling with depression, Celeste voluntarily admitted herself to St. David's Pavilion, a psychiatric treatment facility in Austin. There she met Tracy Tarleton, a bookstore manager. The two developed a relationship that Tarleton later described as romantic and that Celeste consistently denied was anything beyond friendship. On October 3, 1999, at approximately 3:30 in the morning, Stephen Beard called 911 from his home in the Westlake Hills community west of Austin. He had been struck by a shotgun discharge while asleep in his bedroom. He was confused and disoriented when he spoke to the dispatcher, not immediately understanding the nature of his injury. He was transported to a hospital in critical condition. A spent 20-gauge shotgun shell casing was recovered near the bed. Celeste Beard told officers she had been asleep in a separate wing of the home and had not heard anything. Investigators noted that the home's drawers showed signs of having been searched, though most valuables appeared undisturbed. Stephen Beard survived surgery and was hospitalized for nearly 4 months. He died on January 22, 2000, from a blood clot, a complication attributed to the injuries sustained in the October shooting. He was 74 years old. Celeste Beard had visited him regularly throughout his hospitalization. She remained under investigation throughout that period. Information provided by Celeste's daughters and their associates directed investigators toward Tracy Tarleton. Police located a shotgun in Tarleton's possession. Ballistic analysis connected that weapon to the shell casing recovered at the Beard residence. Tarleton was charged with injury to an elderly person. When Stephen Beard died, the charge was upgraded to murder. Following Stephen's death, Celeste Beard's behavior attracted heightened scrutiny. Her spending accelerated. She began a new relationship. Within 6 months of her husband's death, she remarried a man named Cole Johnson and relocated from Austin to South Lake in Tarrant County. Tarleton learned of the remarriage from a newspaper clipping. That is when Tarleton called investigators and told them an entirely different account of what had happened. Tarleton told investigators that she and Celeste had been in a romantic relationship, that Celeste had told her she could not leave the marriage because of the financial arrangements involved, that Celeste had said she would harm herself if she had to remain with Stephen, and that Celeste had asked Tarleton to kill him. Tarleton stated that Celeste had provided access to the home by disabling the security alarm and leaving the bedroom door unlocked on the night of the shooting. In exchange for her cooperation and testimony against Celeste, Tarleton was offered a reduced sentence of 20 years. Celeste Beard was indicted in March 2002 and charged with capital murder under the Texas law of parties, the legal framework holding a defendant responsible for an offense committed by another person when they solicited, encouraged, or aided that act. She pleaded not guilty. At trial, prosecutors presented detailed financial records documenting the motive, a will that provided Celeste with a multi-million-dollar inheritance in the event of Stephen's death, combined with a divorce scenario that would have yielded a significantly smaller settlement. The accountant's testimony established that Celeste's potential divorce settlement had effectively already been spent through her purchases during the marriage. Tracy Tarleton testified at length about the nature of the relationship and the discussions that, she said, had led to the shooting. Celeste's twin daughters testified against their mother, corroborating elements of Tarleton's account and testifying about a recorded phone conversation in which Celeste could be heard discussing an attempt to hire someone to harm Tarleton. The defense alleged that the daughters stood to benefit financially from their mother's conviction, as the terms of Stephen Beard's estate would shift depending on whether Celeste was found culpable for his death. Celeste did not testify at her own trial. Her attorney Dick D. Guerin, one of Texas's most prominent criminal defense attorneys, argued that Tarleton had acted entirely on her own, driven by an obsessive attachment that Celeste had not encouraged, and that Tarleton's documented history of mental health treatment made her an unreliable witness. He challenged the financial motive argument and the credibility of the daughter's testimony. The jury convicted Celeste Beard of capital murder under the Texas law of parties in 2003. Under Texas law, the conviction required a mandatory life sentence, with a minimum of 40 years to be served before parole eligibility. She will not be eligible for parole consideration until April 1, 2042, when she will be 79 years old. Tracy Tarleton served 10 years of her 20-year sentence and was released on parole in August 2011. She returned to San Antonio, where she has spoken publicly and expressed remorse about her role in the case. Celeste Beard, now known as Celeste Beard Johnson following her remarriage, continues to serve her sentence at the Lane Murray unit in Gattisville, Texas. She has consistently maintained her innocence in every subsequent media appearance and legal filing, including a 2022 interview with ABC News. Her conviction was affirmed by the Texas Court of Appeals in 2006. The financial record in this case was among the most detailed ever assembled for a capital murder prosecution in Travis County. $670,000 spent in 6 months. A $12 million estate. A divorce settlement is already depleted. Those numbers told a story that the jury found more persuasive than the defense's alternative account. The Beard case was featured as the very first episode of the Oxygen Network documentary series Snapped when it premiered in 2004. It remains one of the most studied spousal homicide cases in Texas legal history. Case 3. Clara Harris, Harris County, Texas incident. July 24, 2002 conviction. February 14, 2003 A private investigator hired by a wife to document her husband's affair captured the entire incident on videotape. The footage was played for a national audience. It became the first time in Houston area criminal history that a live killing was recorded on camera and subsequently used as the primary evidence in a murder trial. That is what made this case unlike anything Texas courts had seen before. Clara Suarez Harris was a dentist. She had immigrated from Colombia, earned her professional credentials in the United States, and by 2002 was operating a chain of orthodontic offices in the Houston area alongside her husband David Harris, an orthodontist. The couple had built the practice together into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. They lived in an upscale estate in Friendswood, Texas, in the southern suburbs of Houston. They had twin sons, Brian and Bradley, born in 1998. David also had a daughter, Lindsay, from a previous relationship who lived in Ohio with her mother. Clara and David Harris had married on Valentine's Day, February 14, 1992, at the Nassau Bay Hilton Hotel, located directly across from the Johnson Space Center in Nassau Bay, Texas. During their marriage, David Harris began a relationship with Gail Bridges, a woman who had previously worked as a receptionist at one of their offices. Clara became aware of the situation and hired Blue Moon Investigations, a private detective agency, to document her husband's activities. On July 24, 2002, the agency notified Clara that David was at a hotel with Bridges. The hotel was the Nassau Bay Hilton, the same location where Clara and David had been married 10 years and 5 months earlier. Clara Harris drove to the hotel. David's 16-year-old daughter Lindsay, who was visiting from Ohio, was with her. Blue Moon investigators were present and had activated their recording equipment. A confrontation occurred in the hotel lobby between Clara Harris and Gail Bridges. Witnesses later testified to what they observed during that confrontation. David Harris, who had been walking Bridges toward her vehicle, was in the hotel parking lot when Clara Harris got into her silver Mercedes-Benz and drove it into the area where he was standing. The entire sequence of events that followed was recorded on the Blue Moon surveillance footage. David Harris was struck by a vehicle and died at a hospital several hours later from the injuries he sustained. Clara Harris was present at the scene and was taken into custody. She told reporters at the scene that the incident had been an accident. David Harris's daughter Lindsay was in the vehicle throughout the incident. Bobby Basher of Blue Moon Investigations stated in subsequent interviews, "I think of Clara Harris every day, because this was one of the first cases where I watched a live murder being captured on videotape." Clara Harris's trial began in Harris County in January 2003. The video evidence was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Jurors watched the surveillance footage. They heard testimony from the Blue Moon investigators, from hotel witnesses, and from law enforcement. The prosecution argued that the sequence of events documented on the footage was inconsistent with an accident and demonstrated deliberate intent. Lindsay Harris testified for the prosecution. Her account included the statement that she had called out to Clara to stop the vehicle. Her presence in the car throughout the incident was one of the most discussed elements of the case both during trial and in public commentary that followed. The defense argued that Clara Harris had acted not with premeditated intent but in a state of extreme emotional disturbance upon discovering her husband at the very hotel where they had been married. A set of circumstances, the defense argued, That represented a degree of psychological crisis that placed the act within a different legal category than deliberate murder. The jury accepted a specific legal finding under Texas law, that Clara Harris had acted under sudden passion rather than with deliberate intent. This legal determination reduced the offense from first-degree murder to a second-degree felony and capped the maximum sentence at 20 years. The jury imposed the maximum allowed under that finding. On February 14, 2003, what would have been Clara and David Harris's 11th wedding anniversary, she was sentenced to 20 years in prison and fined $10,000. She was incarcerated at the Mountain View Unit in Gattisville, Texas. During her imprisonment, she participated in a program converting school textbooks to Braille format for students with visual impairments. She was twice denied parole before the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles approved her parole request in 2018, after she had served 15 years of her sentence. Clara Harris was released in May 2018 at the age of 60. Her twin sons had been raised by family friends during her imprisonment. Her felony conviction permanently barred her from practicing dentistry. A civil wrongful death lawsuit brought by David Harris's parents had produced a judgment of approximately $3.75 million against her, a sum she was reported to have no financial capacity to satisfy at the time of her release. Her parole requirements continued until February 2023, nearly 21 years after the original incident, at which point the Texas Department of Public Safety confirmed that she had completed all parole obligations. Clara Harris is currently 65 years old. She is no longer under state supervision. The significance of the Clara Harris case within Texas criminal history extends beyond the facts of the incident itself. It was the first case in the Houston area, and among the first in the country, in which a killing was captured on continuous video by a private investigator operating in a professional capacity, and in which that footage was used as the primary evidentiary basis for a murder conviction. The case changed how private investigators in Texas document surveillance assignments. It changed how prosecutors think about video evidence in intimate partner homicide cases. And it established a precedent, reinforced by the subsequent proliferation of surveillance cameras, doorbell cameras, and cell phone cameras for what a documentary evidentiary record of a violent act can look like when the act occurs in a public or semi-public space. The question of intent, whether the video showed a deliberate act or an act of emotional crisis, was resolved by the jury's sudden passion finding, which has continued to be discussed in Texas legal scholarship as a case study in how intent is evaluated in the context of intimate partner confrontations. David Harris's family has continued to be affected by the case in the years since his death. His daughter Lindsay, who was 16 at the time and present in the vehicle throughout the incident, has described the lasting impact of that experience in interviews given years afterward. The twin sons Brian and Bradley were raised in the custody of family friends and were reported to visit their mother approximately once a month during her incarceration. Case 4. Susan Wright, Harris County, Texas. Events: January 13, 2003. Conviction: 2004. She did not call 911. She did not report her husband missing. She painted the bedroom walls. And 5 days later, she called her attorney, told him where the body was buried, and turned herself into the authorities. The confession was voluntary. The investigation that followed was not straightforward, and the trial that resulted became one of the most discussed proceedings in Houston's legal history. Susan Lucille Wright was born on April 24, 1976, in Houston, Texas. She met Jeff Wright in 1997 while working as a restaurant waitress in Galveston, and the two married in 1998. The couple settled in northwest Harris County, where Susan became a stay-at-home mother to 2 children, a son named Bradley and a daughter named Kaylee. Jeff Wright worked in the construction industry. The marriage was described in completely different terms by the prosecution and the defense at trial. The prosecution described Jeff Wright as a working man with an outgoing personality who had built a stable household, with a $200,000 life insurance policy naming Susan as the beneficiary. The defense described him as a man with a documented cocaine habit and a history of physical and emotional abuse directed toward his wife, and described Susan to the jury as Jeff's physical and mental punching bag. On January 18, 2003, 5 days after the events that would form the basis of the charges, Susan Wright contacted her attorney Neil Davis and asked him to come to her home. When Davis arrived, she told him that she had killed her husband on the night of January 13th and that his remains were buried in the backyard in a partially excavated hole that had been intended for a koi pond that the couple had been planning to install. Davis contacted the Harris County District Attorney's office. Susan Wright turned herself into authorities at the Harris County Courthouse on January 24, 2003, and was arraigned on murder charges. She had painted the walls of the master bedroom in the days between the incident and her confession. Jeff Wright's remains were recovered from the backyard. The medical examiner's examination established that he had sustained 193 separate wound patterns and had been bound to the bed with neckties. The configuration of the scene was central to the prosecution's argument about the nature of the act. Susan Wright's murder trial commenced on February 24, 2004, in Harris County. She was prosecuted by Assistant District Attorney Kelly Siegler, who would later become one of the most recognized names in Texas prosecutorial history, and subsequently the host of the Oxygen Network documentary series Cold Justice. The trial became nationally notable for a specific moment during the prosecution's closing argument, with the actual mattress from the Wright home admitted into evidence. Siegler conducted a physical reenactment of the prosecution's theory of the act, using her co-counsel as a stand-in to demonstrate the configuration the prosecution argued was established by the forensic evidence. The reenactment took place on the mattress itself, with the actual neckties that had been used to restrain Jeff Wright. The jury observed the entire demonstration. Media coverage of the reenactment was extensive and continued for years afterward as a reference point in discussions of prosecutorial technique. Susan Wright testified in her own defense. She described the night of January 13th in detail, stating that Jeff had returned home after consuming cocaine, had physically assaulted her, and had subsequently produced a knife. She testified that she had been able to take the weapon from him and that she had acted in self-defense. Her testimony was emotional and detailed. Siegler argued in rebuttal that the physical configuration of the scene, the bound victim, the distribution of evidence, the subsequent burial and concealment activities, was entirely inconsistent with the scenario Wright described, and that the insurance policy provided a financial motive for a planned rather than spontaneous act. The jury deliberated for 5 hours and returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of first-degree murder. The sentence was 25 years in prison. Susan Wright's appeal to the 14th Court of Appeals of Texas was unsuccessful as to the conviction itself, which was upheld in 2005. However, a subsequent proceeding produced a more significant result. In 2009, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals granted a new sentencing hearing, finding that her trial counsel had rendered ineffective assistance during the punishment phase of the original trial by failing to present available mitigating evidence. That evidence included documented information about abuse in Susan Wright's own background, corroborated by her sister, a college professor. District Judge Jim Wallace, who had presided over the original trial, determined at the resentencing hearing that while Susan Wright had unquestionably caused Jeff Wright's death, substantial mitigating evidence had not been placed before the original sentencing jury. On November 20, 2010, her sentence was reduced to 20 years in prison. She was first eligible for parole in February 2014. That request was denied. A second request in July 2017 was also denied. In July 2020, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles approved parole, contingent on completion of a specified program. She was released from the Lane Murray unit in Gattisville on December 30, 2020, having served more than 16 years. At the time of her release, she was placed on super-intensive supervision, the highest level of parole monitoring in the Texas system, and required to wear a GPS monitoring device, complete anger management counseling, and remain in Texas. Those requirements remained in effect until February 2024. Jeff Wright's two children, Bradley and Kaylee, were adopted by their paternal uncle following their mother's conviction and incarceration. In April 2026, Susan Wright, now using her maiden name Susan Weich, was charged with leaving the scene of a motor vehicle accident in Harris County, according to court records. The Wright case remains a reference point in Texas legal education for two reasons that are somewhat in tension with each other. The first is the courtroom reenactment, which is studied in both prosecutorial training programs and legal ethics courses as an example of the outer boundaries of permissible demonstrative argument. The second is the appellate finding of ineffective assistance during the punishment phase, which is studied as an example of how the failure to present mitigating evidence at sentencing can result in a sentence that does not reflect the complete picture of a defendant's circumstances, and of the appellate mechanisms available to correct that kind of procedural failure. End of Case 4. Subscribe now if you have not already. Case 5 is one of the most forensically detailed cases we cover tonight. Case 5. A&A Trujillo Harris County, Texas Events, June 9, 2013 Conviction, April 8, 2014 When police arrived at the apartment, the defendant answered the door. There was blood on her clothing and on her hands. A man was down in the hallway. A blue suede high-heeled shoe was on the floor near him. Blood spatter evidence on the walls and on the defendant's clothing would later allow forensic analysts to reconstruct the positions and movements of both individuals during the incident with considerable precision. That physical reconstruction of events was central to what this case became. Ana Trujillo was born in Mexico and had lived in Houston for a number of years, working at various points as a massage therapist and in other service-oriented roles. In the period leading up to June 2013, she had been in a relationship with Dr. Alf Stefan Andersson, a 59-year-old Swedish-born biochemist and research professor at the University of Houston, where he held faculty positions related to medical research. Colleagues and close friends described Andersson consistently as measured, non-confrontational, and widely liked within his professional community. The relationship between Trujillo and Andersson was, at the time of the incident, in a complicated state. The two were no longer together in the conventional sense, though they continued to spend time in one another's company. On the evening of June 8, 2013, extending into the early morning hours of June 9, Trujillo and Andersson spent several hours at a neighborhood bar in Houston's Museum District. Security footage from the bar and from the lobby of Andersson's high-rise apartment building, the Park Lane, became significant components of the evidentiary record. The lobby footage was reviewed by investigators and described in court testimony as showing Andersson entering the elevator with his posture and movement consistent with someone who was tired or subdued, not agitated or aggressive. A cab driver who had transported Trujillo and Andersson from the bar to the apartment testified at trial that Trujillo had been loudly confrontational and angry during the ride, not Andersson. At 3:41 in the morning on June 9, 2013, a 911 call was placed from inside Andersson's apartment. The caller was Trujillo. She was audibly distressed and difficult to understand. When officers and paramedics arrived, Stefan Andersson was found unresponsive on the apartment floor. He had died before their arrival. A blue suede closed-toe high-heeled pump, size 9, with a 5.5-inch heel, was on the carpeted floor near his head. A substantial amount of blood was present at the scene. The medical examiner determined that Andersson had sustained 25 distinct impact patterns, concentrated on his face and head, consistent with the heel of the shoe recovered at the scene. The injuries were extensive and concentrated, indicating a sustained rather than brief application of force. Blood spatter analysis conducted by investigators established that the pattern of blood distribution on the walls and on Trujillo's clothing was consistent with the person delivering the impacts from a position above and over the victim as he lay on his back on the floor. This reconstruction was based on the physics of blood behavior under known conditions of velocity, surface contact, and angle, not on witness accounts. Ana Trujillo was taken from the scene for questioning. During the interrogation, which ran for approximately 1 hour and was recorded in its entirety, she stated that Andersson had become jealous and aggressive after they returned from the bar, and that she had acted in self-defense. She told investigators she had made contact with his face using her shoe on a small number of occasions and had not realized the severity of the outcome until she observed blood on the floor. In the months between the June 2013 incident and her April 2014 trial, Trujillo participated in multiple media interviews and consistently described the relationship in terms that characterized Andersson as the aggressor. Andersson's friends and professional associates, in their statements to investigators and their testimony at trial, provided accounts directly at odds with that characterization. They described a man with no history of aggressive behavior who had been a gentle and engaged presence in their lives and professional community. The prosecution's case at trial was built on three primary evidentiary pillars: the medical examiner's findings regarding the nature, number, and distribution of the impact patterns, the blood spatter reconstruction establishing the physical configuration during the incident, and the testimony of the cab driver and lobby footage regarding the relative states of Trujillo and Anderson in the period immediately preceding the incident. Harris County Prosecutor John Jordan described the evidentiary significance of the blood spatter analysis in testimony, the distribution of blood on the walls, the cast-off pattern, and the saturation of Trujillo's clothing with blood collectively told an account of events that was, he argued, inconsistent with a brief defensive act and consistent with a prolonged and one-sided application of force. The defense argued that the prosecution had not established motive, that Trujillo was physically smaller than Anderson, and that the degree of force applied was consistent with the actions of a person genuinely in fear. Trujillo did not testify during the guilt phase of the trial. The jury heard from her directly through the 1-hour police interrogation recording and the 911 call. Deliberations lasted less than 2 hours. The jury returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of murder. During the sentencing phase, Trujillo testified and conducted a physical reenactment of her version of events for the jury, using her defense attorney as a stand-in. She described her relationship with Anderson and maintained that she had acted defensively. The jury sentenced her to life in prison. Ana Trujillo is currently serving that sentence at the Gattisville Correctional Facility in Gattisville, Texas, approximately 200 miles northwest of Houston. She has continued to maintain, including in a subsequent prison interview with a Houston television station, that the events of June 9, 2013, were the result of an act of self-defense and that the death of Stefan Anderson was not an intended outcome. The blue suede stiletto shoe recovered from the apartment is held in the Harris County Criminal Evidence Archives. The Trujillo case is studied in Texas forensic science and law enforcement training programs as a case study in the application of blood spatter analysis to the reconstruction of positions and movements during an incident, and as an example of how physical evidence can be used to evaluate and challenge a self-defense claim when witness accounts are contested. The case also illustrates the evidentiary significance of surveillance footage from public spaces and transportation services in reconstructing the timeline and behavioral context leading up to an incident. Material that, in a case with no direct eyewitnesses to the incident itself, provides the closest available approximation of the observable record. End of Case 5. We are halfway through tonight's cases. If you are watching on a phone, scroll down and leave a comment. Case 6 takes us to the Dallas-Fort Worth area and a case built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. Case 6. Michelle Williams, Tarrant County, Texas. Events: October 13, 2011. Conviction: September 2014. She told police an intruder dressed in black had broken into the house. Then she told them her husband had taken his own life. Then investigators documented every contradiction between those two accounts and presented the full sequence to a jury. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. This is the Michelle Williams case. Michelle Williams was 45 years old in October 2011. She lived in Keller, Texas, an affluent suburb northwest of Fort Worth in the Dallas-Fort Worth metroplex, with her husband Greg Williams, who was 40 years old. Greg Williams worked in the financial sector. According to records introduced at trial, his professional income in 2010 exceeded $500,000, and in 2011 exceeded $800,000. The family lived in an exclusive neighborhood in Keller. Their daughter was approximately 10 to 14 years old at the time and was in the home on the night in question. On the night of October 13, 2011, Michelle Williams contacted police and reported that an intruder dressed in black had entered the home and had shot her husband as he slept in the couple's bedroom. She described the intruder as unknown to her. Responding officers arrived to find Greg Williams in the master bedroom having sustained a gunshot wound to the head from a .45 caliber handgun. He had died from the wound. The investigation that followed was, as the Deputy Chief District Attorney who later prosecuted the case Jack Strickland described it, one involving convoluted facts, strange twists and turns, and complicated questions of law. From the outset, investigators documented inconsistencies. The home showed no physical signs consistent with forced entry. The physical conditions of the scene did not align with the description of an unknown intruder having entered and exited. The .45 caliber handgun used in the shooting was identified and subjected to forensic examination. Prosecutors alleged that the weapon had been handled after the shooting in a manner intended to complicate ballistic analysis, specifically that Michelle Williams had wiped down the gun. This allegation became the basis for a separate evidence tampering count presented to the jury alongside the murder charge. As the investigation developed over subsequent months, Michelle Williams's account of events changed. She told investigators at different points that an intruder had committed the shooting, and on another occasion said that Greg had taken his own life. Prosecutors catalogued these contradictions and placed them before the jury as evidence of consciousness of guilt, the legal principle that certain behaviors following a crime, including changing one's account of events, can be interpreted as indicating awareness of culpability. The prosecution's financial motive argument was built around the specific insurance documentation. Greg Williams's life was covered by policies with a combined benefit of approximately $650,000, with Michelle Williams designated as the beneficiary. Prosecutor Sheila Wynn characterized Williams to the jury as a person who had changed her story repeatedly in an attempt to avoid accountability. Who does this, Wynn asked the jury? Someone who is trying to blame everyone else. Someone who is trying to get away with murder. The defense presented a substantively different account. Defense attorneys argued that Greg Williams had been under significant emotional strain at the time of his death, having recently experienced the deaths of a close friend and a grandmother, and had ended his own life. They challenged the financial motive argument directly, pointing to the documented income figures. If Greg Williams was earning between $500,000 and $800,000 per year, his attorneys argued, the $650,000 insurance payout represented less than 1 year's income, and therefore did not constitute a compelling financial motive for a woman whose household was already financially secure. The defense also argued that Michelle Williams's inconsistent statements to police were not evidence of guilt but of a mother attempting to protect her young daughter from the full reality of what she believed had occurred. The jury deliberated for approximately 7 hours and returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of first-degree murder and on the evidence tampering charge related to the firearm. She was acquitted on a second tampering count. At the penalty phase the following day, the jury sentenced Michelle Williams to 60 years in prison on the murder conviction, with a concurrent 10 years on the tampering conviction. The controlling sentence was 60 years. Strickland issued a statement following the verdict. This circumstantial evidence case involved convoluted facts, strange twists and turns, and complicated questions of law. The jury carefully and patiently considered and resolved each of those issues. The case was featured in a segment on CBS News's documentary franchise under the title Temptation in Texas and has been referenced in multiple law enforcement training discussions of how changing accounts to investigators can function as evidence of consciousness of guilt in a circumstantial case. Michelle Williams is currently serving her 60-year sentence in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice system. The Williams case illustrates a principle that experienced homicide investigators and prosecutors identify regularly in cases where the evidence is entirely circumstantial. The defendant's own statements frequently become the most significant evidence in the prosecution's case, not because of what is said, but because of the pattern of what changes, what is omitted, what is added, and what cannot be reconciled with the physical evidence already documented at the scene. In the Williams case, the absence of forced entry evidence and the documented contradictions between the two separate accounts she gave investigators, the intruder account and the suicide account, became the framework around which the prosecution constructed its argument. Combined with the insurance documentation establishing financial motive and the forensic evidence related to the handling of the firearm, those contradictions formed the backbone of a circumstantial case that the jury found sufficient to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Case 7. Sandra Melgar, Harris County, Texas. Events: December 22 to 23, 2012. Conviction: August 23, 2017. Case 7. Sandra Melgar, Harris County, Texas. Events: December 22 to 23, 2012. Conviction: August 23, 2017. Important note: the conviction of Sandra Melgar is actively contested. The Innocence Project of Texas accepted her case in December 2022 and is currently conducting an ongoing investigation. The facts presented here reflect the full trial record, the investigative documentation, and the post-conviction proceedings as reported in court filings and verified media coverage. The crime scene presents this case with full transparency that it is one in which the question of guilt has not been settled to the satisfaction of all parties, and in which post-conviction review is ongoing. A husband was found in a locked closet. His wife was found in a separate locked closet, bound, unable to free herself. The lead detective in the case was forced to resign 2 years later from an unrelated investigation involving forged search warrants. When his office was cleared, evidence from this case was found stored improperly in a filing cabinet, untested, and the Innocence Project of Texas has accepted the case. This is the Sandra Melgar case. Sandra and Jamie Melgar had been married for 32 years by December 2012. They had met as students at Lamar High School in Houston, begun dating in their senior year, and married in a downtown Houston courthouse in 1980. Jim Melgar, who had immigrated from Guatemala to the United States at age 3, had built a career as an information technology specialist with the Houston Independent School District. He was 52 years old and 5 months from planned retirement. He and Sandra had been making specific plans for what that retirement would look like. Travel to the Grand Canyon, to Ireland, and to see the Northern Lights. Sandra Melgar worked as a nurse. The couple had one daughter, Elizabeth, known as Liz. They were active members of their faith community as Jehovah's Witnesses. Sandra had several documented medical conditions. Her medical history included rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, hypothyroidism, bilateral hip replacements, and a 34-year documented history of grand mal seizures and associated memory disruption, a condition formally diagnosed and treated since 1978. On the night of December 22, 2012, the couple celebrated their 32nd wedding anniversary. They went to dinner at their regular restaurant, stopped at a pharmacy on the way home, and returned to their Northwest Harris County residence. According to Sandra's account, they relaxed in their jacuzzi together and discussed their plans for the future. Sandra then went to her walk-in closet. The family's dogs began barking outside and Jim went to investigate. The following afternoon, December 23, Jim Melgar's brother and other family members arrived at the home for a scheduled dinner. Receiving no response to calls or knocking, Jim's brother entered through an open garage. He found the interior of the home dark. He located Jim Melgar in a closet. Jim had died from his injuries. Sandra Melgar was found in a separate, locked bathroom closet, with a chair jammed against the door from the inside. She was bound and unable to free herself. She was freed by family members. Her first question after being freed was about her husband's location. Paramedics examined Sandra at the scene. She had no injuries to her hands. Her fingernails were completely intact, with no evidence of physical exertion. She was then taken to the Harris County Sheriff's Office for questioning rather than to a medical facility. Despite her documented medical conditions including her seizure disorder and the circumstances she had reportedly just endured, during the interrogation, Sandra told investigators that she believed she had experienced a seizure during the events, which had caused a gap in her memory of the evening. Her documented 34-year history of grand mal seizures was not disputed as a medical fact by anyone involved in the case. Investigators characterized her memory gaps as suspicious. Sandra's account was consistent with a medically documented condition that can cause loss of consciousness and amnesia for the period of the episode. The investigation was led by Detective Sean Ruben Kerizel of the Harris County Sheriff's Office. The physical evidence at the scene included Jim Melgar's injuries, the kitchen knife that was identified as the instrument of harm and recovered inside the home, and no physical signs that investigators characterized as consistent with forced entry to the residence. There was no blood on Sandra Melgar's hands. There were no injuries to her hands consistent with the kind of physical altercation that had resulted in Jim Melgar's wounds. There was no forensic material, blood, skin, hair, fiber, or any other transfer evidence, physically linking Sandra to the act. Investigators also collected DNA samples from multiple surfaces throughout the home: door handles, dresser drawer pulls, bathroom door handles, and other contact points. Analysis of those samples identified both male and female DNA that did not match either Jim or Sandra Melgar. That unidentified DNA was documented in the investigative record. 2 years after the investigation, Detective Kerizal was forced to resign from the Harris County Sheriff's Office, not in connection with the Melgar case, but because he had been found to have forged search warrants in a separate murder investigation. When his office was cleared following his departure, materials from the Melgar case were found stored in a filing cabinet in his personal office, untested and improperly handled outside the standard evidence chain. Sandra Melgar was charged with murder by a Harris County grand jury on July 21, 2014, 19 months after Jim's death. Her trial did not begin until August 7, 2017, nearly 5 years after the events in question. The prosecution's theory presented to the jury was that Sandra Melgar had staged the home invasion scenario, including her own confinement in the locked closet, in order to create an alibi. The prosecution argued that her faith as a Jehovah's Witness, which does not permit divorce, provided context for why she might have wanted to end the marriage through other means. No witnesses were presented who had observed any marital difficulties between the Melgars. No financial motive was established. No physical evidence linked Sandra to the injuries Jim sustained. The defense challenged each element of the prosecution's theory. Attorneys argued there was no credible mechanism by which a woman with Sandra Melgar's documented physical limitations, surgically replaced hips, active autoimmune disease, and a seizure condition, could have physically committed the act attributed to her, removed all forensic trace from herself while sustaining no injuries and leaving no evidence on her unbroken nails, and placed herself in a bound and locked closet. The defense further argued that the unidentified DNA found throughout the home, belonging to at least one unknown male and one unknown female, was evidence of the presence of people who had not been identified or investigated. The jury returned a verdict of guilty on August 23, 2017. Sandra Melgar's response to the verdict in the courtroom was audible. She was sentenced to 27 years in prison the following day. Her appeals were denied by the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals in 2022. In December 2022, the Innocence Project of Texas announced that it had accepted her case for investigation. Executive Director Mike Ware issued a public statement. The state's whole theory seemed to defy the laws of gravity, much less the laws of logic and common sense. That somehow, she pulled this off without having blood at all on her, without any sign on her she had conducted a clean-up. New DNA testing conducted on a safe that had reportedly been removed from the home during the incident returned results matching an unidentified male with no familial connection to anyone in the Melgar family. That result was announced by the family in late 2022. Sandra Melgar's daughter Liz continues to advocate for her mother's release and maintains she is innocent. The family is offering a $100,000 reward for information. Sandra Melgar remains incarcerated and is eligible for parole consideration beginning February 22, 2031. Case 8. Sarah Hartsfield, Chambers County, Texas. Events: January 7, 2023. Conviction: October 2025. On the morning her husband was hospitalized, messages were sent from his phone to her phone, including a photograph of his driver's license, a wedding photo, bank account details, and a digital key that would give her access to everything on his phone after his death. Investigators concluded she sent those messages herself from his device. That digital evidence, combined with a pattern of prior incidents involving multiple previous partners, formed the foundation of a prosecution that a Chambers County jury resolved in 60 minutes. Sarah Hartsfield was 50 years old at the time of her arrest. She had been married 5 times. Her 5th husband, Joseph Hartsfield, was a diabetic man who managed his condition with insulin administered via pen injection devices kept at his bedside. He was hospitalized on January 7, 2023, and died on January 15, 2023. The medical determination was that the cause of death was consistent with severe hypoglycemia, abnormally low blood sugar at a level inconsistent with therapeutic self-administration of insulin, even significantly in excess of his prescribed dosage. The manner of his death opened a criminal investigation. Detective Skylar Rockers of the Chambers County Sheriff's Office conducted the primary digital forensic analysis of the case. Her findings centered on the messages sent from Joseph Hartsfield's cell phone to Sarah Hartsfield's cell phone on the morning of January 7, the day he was first hospitalized, 8 days before his death. Those messages contained an image of Joseph's driver's license, a wedding photograph of the couple, account details for a bank account Joseph had recently opened, and a digital activation key for Apple Legacy Contact, a feature of the iPhone operating system that must be deliberately configured by the account holder, that requires navigating to a specific section of the phone's settings, generating an access key, and transmitting that key to a designated contact. The designated contact must then accept the assignment. The process is not passive or accidental. It requires conscious, deliberate engagement with the phone's configuration menus over a period of several minutes. Once activated, the Apple Legacy Contact feature gives the designated individual complete authorized access to all data associated with the account after the account holder's death. Messages, photographs, financial applications, stored passwords, and account credentials. Detective Rock examined the metadata associated with the messages, the timestamps, the device activity logs, and the record of how the phone's settings had been navigated in the period before the messages were sent. Her conclusion, presented to the jury: "It is my opinion that she created the legacy contact information and sent it to her phone." Sarah Hartsfield had told investigators she had been asleep and taking narcotic pain medication following a surgical procedure during the relevant hours. Cell phone location data from her own device was inconsistent with that account. The insulin pens at Joseph Hartsfield's bedside were observed at the scene by investigators but were not collected as physical evidence. Detective Rockes acknowledged at trial that this was a decision she regretted. The pens could have provided direct physical evidence relevant to the administration of insulin, fingerprint analysis, residual volume measurements, and potential evidence of calibration tampering. Their absence from the evidence record became a central point of the defense argument. Prosecutors in Chambers County also introduced evidence under the legal doctrine permitting prior act testimony when relevant to establishing intent, motive, or absence of mistake. That evidence included 3 separate categories of prior incidents. The first was the 2018 death of David Bragg, to whom Sarah had been engaged. Bragg died from a gunshot wound. Sarah stated this was self-defense. The local prosecutor's office initially accepted that characterization. After Sarah's indictment in Chambers County, that case was reopened. The detective who reviewed it testified that certain aspects of Sarah's account were, in his description, odd and abnormal, though he stated no charges were anticipated. The second was testimony from an FBI agent about an alleged solicitation, that Sarah had approached her 4th husband and asked him to kill her 3rd husband's new wife. No charges had been filed in connection with this alleged solicitation. The third was an alleged arson at a family home in Missouri. Defense attorney Case Darwin challenged the legal and logical foundations of the prosecution's case. He argued that the state had not presented any direct evidence that Sarah Hartsfield had administered insulin to Joseph Hartsfield. Joseph was diabetic. He had insulin pens at his bedside. His condition, Darwin argued, was one that by its nature could produce dangerous blood sugar fluctuations. Without the pens, without direct physical evidence, the prosecution was asking the jury to convict on inference. The state is like a magician, Darwin told the jury. We all like magic. It's cool, but magic is not real. Chambers County Assistant District Attorney Mallory Vargas summarized the prosecution's position in her closing argument. Sarah Hartsfield believed she would get away with her husband's murder because it's what she's always done. What a wild coincidence that no person can leave her without consequences. The jury deliberated for approximately 1 hour. The verdict was guilty on the charge of first-degree murder. Sarah Hartsfield was sentenced to life in prison. She is currently incarcerated in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice System. The Hartsfield case represents the current frontier of digital forensic evidence in Texas spousal homicide prosecution. The ability to examine not merely who sent a message or made a call, but how a device's operating system was navigated, what settings were deliberately changed, what files were accessed, and whether the device's recorded physical location corroborates or contradicts the user's own account. This level of analysis has fundamentally altered the landscape of circumstantial evidence in criminal proceedings. A fingerprint in 1983 was significant physical evidence. DNA in 2003 was transformative. Digital metadata in 2023 is the current frontier, because it documents what a person was doing, privately, in the hours before and after a crime, in a format that is difficult to destroy and that exists, in multiple redundant forms, on devices and servers that neither sender nor recipient fully controls. The Hartsfield case will be examined in Texas law enforcement and legal training programs for years as a case study in the prosecution of an alleged insulin homicide using digital evidence in the absence of direct physical evidence of the act itself. Case 9. Joyce Sturdivant, McLennan County, Texas. Events: 2008 conviction. 2011 He had been married to her for nearly 40 years when he was found to have died from a gunshot wound while he was asleep. Investigators documented that before acting herself, she had approached multiple men and asked them to do it. None of them agreed. She received $92,000 from his insurance policy after his death. The jury convicted her of both murder and attempted capital murder. This is the Joyce Sturdivant case. Robinson, Texas, is a small city of approximately 11,000 people situated directly south of Waco in McLennan County. It is a quiet, residentially oriented community with established churches, long-standing families, and the kind of close community familiarity that comes with generational continuity. It is not a setting that regularly produces high-profile criminal proceedings. The Sturdivant case was an exception. Joyce Sturdivant was 66 years old at the time of her conviction in 2011. Her husband, Joe Sturdivant Jr., had been 68 years old at the time of his death in 2008. The couple had been married for nearly 40 years, a length of marriage that distinguished this case from several others examined in this documentary and that placed it in a specific legal and investigative context. The length of the marriage is significant for what it eliminates as well as what it establishes. A 40-year marriage is not a brief relationship with a quickly accumulated financial motive. It is a decades-long shared life with intertwined finances, accumulated assets, and the kind of history that makes the investigation of a spouse's death both more complex and more revealing. Investigators examining a 40-year marriage have access to a long documentary record, financial, medical, relational, that a shorter marriage does not provide. What that record revealed in this case was a pattern of financial planning around Joe Sturdivant's death. The $92,000 life insurance policy with Joyce as beneficiary was the financial instrument identified by the prosecution as the motive. That figure, $92,000, is modest compared to the multi-million-dollar insurance and estate structures in cases like Celeste Beard or the Betty Lou Beats pension. But financial motive in a homicide prosecution does not require that the amount be large. It requires that the amount be meaningful to the defendant in the context of their circumstances, and that the financial benefit be documented as a consequence of the death. The most significant evidence in the Sturdivant case was not the insurance policy. It was the prior solicitation. Investigators documented that before the 2008 shooting, Joyce Sturdivant had approached multiple men individually and solicited their participation in causing her husband's death. Each of those men refused. The documentation of those solicitations, gathered from the statements of the men she had approached, established a timeline of premeditation that predated the act itself by a significant period. Under Texas law, a solicitation to commit capital murder is itself a criminal offense. When the prosecution presented both the murder charge and the attempted capital murder charge to the jury, the prior solicitation evidence supported both. For the murder charge, it established premeditation and intent. For the attempted capital murder charge, it established a prior attempt to commission a killing that met the legal threshold for capital murder. The men who had been approached testified at trial. Their accounts of what Joyce Sturdivant had said to them, what she had proposed, what she had implied, and the circumstances in which those conversations had occurred, were among the most substantive testimony the jury heard. They were independent witnesses with no prior relationship to either Joyce or Joe Sturdivant beyond being individuals she had contacted for this purpose. The forensic evidence was straightforward in a way that limited the available defense arguments. Joe Sturdivant had been asleep when he was killed. A sleeping victim cannot be the initiator of a confrontation. The self-defense theory, the sudden passion theory, and the heat of the moment theory were each eliminated by the sleeping condition of the victim as established by forensic evidence. What remained available to the defense was a challenge to the identification of Joyce Sturdivant as the person who had acted and a challenge to the weight and reliability of the prior solicitation testimony. The jury found neither challenge persuasive. Following deliberations, they returned guilty verdicts on both the murder charge and the attempted capital murder charge. They sentenced Joyce Sturdivant to 30 years in prison on the murder conviction, with a concurrent 15 years on the attempted capital murder conviction. The controlling sentence was 30 years. The Sturdivant case is regularly cited in Texas law enforcement training contexts as a textbook example of how prior solicitation evidence functions in a spousal homicide prosecution. When a defendant has attempted, before acting themselves, to recruit others to commit the act, and those individuals subsequently become witnesses, the resulting testimonial record provides a form of independent corroboration of intent that is substantially more powerful than any inference drawn from post-act behavior. In the Betty Lou Beets case, investigators needed a tip from a confidential informant 2 years after the fact. In the Celeste Beard case, the key testimony came from Tracy Tarleton after Tarleton read about Beard's remarriage in a newspaper. In the Joyce Sturdivant case, the prior solicitation witnesses were available from the beginning of the investigation because Joyce Sturdivant had approached them months or years before the act, and they had declined and remembered. That record of declined solicitations, preserved in the memories and subsequent testimony of individuals who had been approached, documented both the premeditation and the financial motive in a way that circumstantial evidence built from the act alone could not have achieved with the same directness. Joyce Sturdivant is serving her 30-year sentence in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice System. Case 10. Darlie Rucher, Dallas County, Texas. Events: June 6, 1996. Conviction: February 4, 1997. Important note: this case involves the deaths of children. In accordance with this documentary's child victim guidelines, ages and outcomes are stated. No descriptions of circumstances, conditions, or events surrounding those deaths are included. The focus of this segment is entirely on the investigation, forensic evidence, legal proceedings, and post-conviction process. Additional note: the Darlie Rucher case is among the most contested capital convictions in Texas history. Post-conviction DNA proceedings remain active before the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. This documentary presents the trial record and the documented post-conviction findings in full, without characterizing the verdict as definitively correct or definitively incorrect. The process is ongoing. She has been on death row in Texas for more than 27 years. Post-conviction DNA testing has identified an unidentified male contributor at the scene whose identity has never been established. The proceedings continue. No execution date has been set. This is the Darlie Rucher case. Darlie Lynn Rucher was 26 years old on June 6, 1996. She was married to Darren Rucher. The family lived at a residential address in Rowlett, Texas, a suburb of Dallas in Dallas County. The couple had 3 sons. On June 6, 1996, their 2 sons, Devon, who was 6 years old, and Damon, who was 5 years old, died. Darlie Rucher sustained injuries including a significant wound to her neck. Darren Rucher, who was sleeping in an upstairs room, was not physically harmed. Darlie Rucher called 911 at approximately 2 in the morning and reported that an intruder had entered the home. First responders arrived within minutes. The Rowlett Police Department and the Dallas County Sheriff's Office conducted the investigation. Within a relatively short period, the investigating agencies developed a theory that challenged the account of an unknown intruder. Investigators identified what they characterized as an absence of physical evidence consistent with an intruder having entered and exited the residence in the manner described. A white athletic sock bearing DNA from both children was recovered in an alley near the home, at a distance from the residence. Investigators argued that the location and condition of the sock was inconsistent with it having been discarded by a fleeing intruder but was consistent with having been placed there as part of a staged scene. The defense argued that the sock's location was entirely consistent with an intruder having dropped it during flight and that investigators had not adequately considered that alternative. The prosecution's theory, presented at trial, was that Darlie Rucher had injured herself to create the appearance of having been attacked, and that the physical evidence reconstructed a scenario inconsistent with the intruder account she had provided. Expert witnesses testified about wound analysis, blood distribution throughout the scene, fiber evidence, and the physical dimensions of the crime scene in relation to the movements that would have been required to produce the conditions that investigators documented. The defense presented counter-expert testimony challenging the forensic conclusions reached by the prosecution's analysts. Defense experts offered interpretations of the same physical evidence consistent with the intruder scenario. The defense pointed specifically to the severity of Dali Rucha's neck wound, which medical testimony established had come within 2 millimeters of her carotid artery, as evidence that she had genuinely been physically harmed in the incident, and that the injury was not self-inflicted. The trial was conducted in Kerrville, Texas, in Kerr County, having been moved from Dallas County due to the extent of pre-trial media coverage that had made selecting an impartial jury in the original venue impracticable. During the trial, the prosecution introduced footage from a graveside event held 1 week after the deaths, a birthday memorial for Devin Rucha. The footage showed Dali Rucha participating in what appeared to observers, including the jury, to be a celebratory atmosphere, including a moment with Silly String. Prosecutors used this footage to address the question of Dali Rucha's demeanor and emotional state in the period following the deaths of her sons. Defense attorneys argued at trial and in every subsequent proceeding that the footage introduced to the jury was a selective excerpts from a substantially longer recording. They maintained that the full tape showed an extended period of visible grief preceding the Silly String moment, and that Devin Rucha had loved Silly String specifically, making the gesture a personal memorial act rather than an expression of indifference. They argued that presenting only the excerpts created a materially misleading impression of the complete event. The full tape was not presented to the jury. The jury convicted Dali Rucha of the capital murder of her son Damon on February 4, 1997, and imposed a death sentence. The post-conviction proceedings in the Rucha case have been among the most extensive in Texas legal history. Investigative journalists, forensic specialists, legal scholars, and organized advocacy groups have examined the case record in detail over more than 2 decades. Specific forensic conclusions reached at trial have been challenged in subsequent expert analysis. Questions have been raised about investigative procedures, about the handling of certain physical evidence, and about the content and presentation of the Silly String footage. DNA testing conducted in 2019 and 2020 on evidence items from the scene returned results that included genetic material from an unidentified male contributor in multiple locations. That contributor has not been identified. Those results were submitted to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals as the basis for a new appeal, arguing that the unidentified DNA is materially inconsistent with the prosecution's theory that no intruder was present. As of the time of this documentary's production, those appellate proceedings remain active before the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. No ruling has been issued. No execution date has been scheduled. Dali Rucha has maintained her innocence in every available forum since her conviction in February 1997. She is currently incarcerated at the Mountain View Unit in Gattisville, Texas. She has been on death row for more than 27 years, making her one of the longest-serving death row inmates in Texas. The Rucha case occupies a unique position in the landscape of Texas criminal proceedings. It is not a case in which the legal process has reached a settled conclusion that all parties accept. It is a case in which a jury reached a verdict based on the evidence presented to them at trial, in which post-conviction review has produced new forensic results that have not yet been adjudicated, and in which the fundamental question of factual accuracy remains before the courts. The presence of unidentified male DNA at the scene is not, by itself, proof of any particular conclusion. DNA from unknown contributors can be present in a home for many reasons unrelated to a specific crime. What it represents, in legal terms, is an evidentiary question that a court must evaluate and address, and that question, in the Rucha case, has not yet been addressed to a final determination. The courts will continue to evaluate it. The process will continue to unfold. 10 cases, 42 years. The state of Texas. From Betty Lou Beats at Cedar Creek Lake in the summer of 1983.